The city was alive with neon lights and the distant hum of traffic, but in the quieter corners, the reality of struggle was hidden in the shadows. Boston's streets, usually bustling with life, felt harsher at night, especially for those who had nowhere to go. Mark Wahlberg, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, walked with his hands tucked into his pockets. He had spent the evening catching up with old friends at a local restaurant, but now, taking a shortcut through a dimly lit side street, he noticed something that made him slow down. Against the brick wall of a closed convenience store, a teenage boy sat hunched over, his arms wrapped tightly around a small girl who couldn't be older than 7. They were both dressed in worn-out clothes, too thin for the biting cold. The boy's sneakers had holes in them, and his jacket barely covered. His shivering sister. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Mark's steps grew slower. He had seen plenty of hardship growing up, but this was different. The boy's eyes flickered towards Mark as if sensing he was being watched. There was no plea for help in his gaze, just a quiet, exhausted defiance. He held his little sister tighter, pulling his tattered hoodie over her head in a futile attempt to keep her warm. Mark glanced around. People passed by without sparing them a second look. How many had walked past already? How many had chosen not to see? Mark took a slow breath, then took a step closer. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice calm but firm. The boy stiffened. His arms instinctively tightened around his sister as he stared at Mark. His posture screamed one thing: distrust. And Mark knew in that moment this wasn't just about offering food or money. This was about breaking down a wall that had been built from too many nights of survival. The cold night air settled over the dimly lit alleyway. A distant street lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. A few cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the two figures huddled against the wall. Mark Wahlberg took a step closer, hands still in his pockets. "You don't have to be scared, kid." The boy didn't move, his arms wrapped protectively around his little sister. "We're fine," he muttered, voice hoarse from exhaustion. Mark crouched slightly, keeping his tone casual. "Sitting out here all night? That doesn't seem fine to me." The little girl stirred, blinking up at Mark with sleepy, confused eyes. She couldn't be older than 7, her tiny hands gripping her brother's jacket. Zach hesitated. He wasn't used to people stopping. Most ignored them. Some stared, but never for long. Mark glanced at his watch. "What's your name?" Zach swallowed. "Zach. And my sister's Lily." Mark nodded. "All right, Zach. There's a diner down the street. Warm food, a place to sit. No expectations. Just a meal. What do you say?" Zach's jaw clenched. He had learned not to trust easily. But Lily's shivering had gotten worse. After a long pause, he gave a reluctant nod. Mark stood up. "All right, let's get out of this cold." For the first time in a long time, Zach and Lily followed someone, not because they had to, but because maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The warm air of the diner was a sharp contrast to the cold night outside. The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the space, mingling with the soft hum of late-night conversations. A few truckers sat at the counter, a waitress refilled. Coffee mugs and the faint sound of a radio played in the background. Mark led Zach and Lily to a booth by the window. The vinyl seats squeaked slightly as they sat down. Lily, still huddled close to her brother, glanced around, her eyes wide. It had been a long time since she had been anywhere warm. A waitress approached, holding a notepad. She gave the kids a kind smile, but her eyes lingered on their worn-out clothes. "What can I get for you?" she asked. Zach looked unsure, glancing at Mark. Mark leaned back, nodding toward the menu. "Anything you want. My treat." Zach hesitated, but Lily's eyes flickered toward the pictures of pancakes and eggs. Her stomach growled softly. Zach sighed, shoulders tense. "Just a burger," he mumbled. Mark raised an eyebrow. "And for your sister?" Zach hesitated. Lily fidgeted slightly before whispering, "Pancakes?" Mark smiled at the waitress. "One burger, one big stack of pancakes, and 2 hot chocolates." As the waitress walked away, Zach finally exhaled. He wasn't sure if it was hunger or something else, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a little lighter. The food arrived quickly. A steaming plate of pancakes was set in front of Lily, and her eyes lit up for the first time that night. Zach, more hesitant, stared at his burger as if it were too good to be real. Mark leaned forward, watching them take their first bites. Lily ate eagerly, but Zach was slower, his guard still up. "So," Mark said, sipping his coffee, "how long have you been out here?" Zach tensed, chewing carefully before answering. "A while." Mark nodded, not pushing. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. Mark exhaled, glancing briefly out the window before turning back to Zach. "You know, I grew up in Boston too. Not in the fancy parts. I had brothers, I beats, big family, but we didn't always have it easy. I know what it's like to feel like the world is moving on without you." Zach blinked, caught off guard. He had expected pity, not understanding. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black card. He slid it across the table. "That's a number for someone who can help. No shelters, no charity, just real help." Zach stared at the card. He didn't touch it. "You don't have to call today," Mark continued. "But when you're ready, that door will be open." Zach's fingers hovered over the card before finally gripping it tightly. His walls weren't gone, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. For months, every day had been the same, a fight to survive, a night spent wondering how much longer he could do it. But this was different. This wasn't just a meal. This wasn't just words. This was a way out. Mark stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table. "Stay as long as you need." As he walked toward the door, Lily's voice stopped him. "Thank you." Mark turned, smiling. Softly, "Anytime, kid." Outside, the cold wind hit him again. But something was different. Inside, Zach stared at the card in his hand, gripping it tighter. For the first time in a long time, he had a choice. If you had the chance to change someone's life, would you take it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're inspired by this story, subscribe now, because tomorrow we have another powerful one waiting just for you.